"Bow your head." Kane's voice cracked like a whip through the air, his eyes blazing with contempt. Maya shouted back, her voice trembling but fierce, "I have the right to stand tall. No one has the right to humiliate me." His cold laugh tore through the hallway. "The only rights you have are the ones I give you." The baton came down, red blood streaking across Maya's forehead, making the crowd of students scream she's just a student. But no one dared step in to stop him. The high school hallway, just after the class bell rang, still echoed with the chaos of hundreds of footsteps and bursts of laughter. But that noise was quickly swallowed by an eerie silence, thick and heavy, as if the entire building had been draped in an invisible shroud. Bulletin boards along the walls still trembled from the rush of students' flyers, for extracurriculars fluttered weakly. But at the far end of the hall, everything seemed pinned in place by the presence of Officer Kane. His burly figure in uniform stood like a wall, blocking the corridor, eyes narrowed like a predator on the hunt. A few students started to veer off in another direction to avoid him, but then stopped, curiosity mixing with fear. No one said a word. Only the sound of footsteps echoed steadily, and in that moment Kane spoke, his shrill voice tearing through the air. "Where do you think you're going, black kid? Who gave you permission at this hour?" The sound slammed into everyone's chest, turning the bright open hallway into a cramped bunker. Maya Thompson froze, clutching her books tightly, her breath quick and shallow. The slender 17-year-old girl had never imagined an ordinary school day could explode into a brutal confrontation right in the place that was supposed to feel the safest. Sweat dotted her forehead. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes did not lower. In the suffocating air, Maya's voice broke out shaky but clear, as if trying to cling to the last thread of dignity. "I'm just going to class. This isn't a prison." Her words were small, fragile, like a strand of thread, yet loud enough to make some people look up in shock. A few students exchanged glances, unable to believe Maya had talked back, had dared to speak straight to the face of someone everyone saw as the ultimate authority on campus. Kane narrowed his eyes, a sneer stretching across his mouth. He didn't respond right away, instead stepped forward slowly. The sound of his shoes striking the tile floor felt like a hammer pounding the hearts of those watching. The overhead neon lights reflected off the baton he twirled in his hand, the glint slicing across Maya's face. The air thickened, and sweat dampened the backs of a few students. Kane leaned in closer, his breath reeking of smoke, blowing straight into Maya's face, his eyes lit with cruel amusement. Then he gritted his teeth and growled, each word, every syllable, landing like a punch to the ears. "Around here, I make the rules." A silence stretched tight like a cord on the verge of snapping. Maya stood, frozen, heart racing, but her gaze never left Kane's face. In her trembling eyes, a small light stubbornly remained a spark, defying the weight of blind authority. The students nearby held their breath. No one dared move. Someone raised a phone to record hands shaking the video, already unsteady because the person filming couldn't stay calm. One of Maya's friends bit his lip hard. His face flushed, ready to step forward. But when Kane's eyes swept toward him, he shrank back, fear taken over. In Maya's mind, his cruel words echoed over and over, weaving with the pounding of her heart into a chaotic symphony of fear and fury. She felt as if the entire hallway was spinning, the white walls turning into prison barriers, and Kane standing there as a giant warden. But even as her hands trembled with fear, a storm surged in her chest with a single question: if I bow my head today, how many other children will be forced to bow tomorrow? Kane saw that hesitation and believed he had already won. His smile widened, satisfied, like a beast that had just caught its prey. He tightened his grip on the baton, veins bulging along his forearm. He stepped forward, half a pace close enough for Maya to feel the threat in the shadow cast over her. A little girl, tucked into a corner, began to cry, her lonely sobs echoing, making the air even more suffocating. A few other students looked at each other, chests heaving, but None had the courage to speak. Maya clutched her books to her chest like the only shield she had. She knew she was standing at the thin line between survival and destruction, but she also understood that if she backed down, every watching eye would learn to stay silent forever. She lifted her head, her gaze trembling but defiant. Kane saw that defiance, and it drove him mad. He roared, his voice like thunder. "Bow your head," I said. "Bow your head." The shout shook the entire hallway. Classroom doors quivered from the force. In that moment, the space seemed to split open. The kids who remained shrank into themselves, phones still raised, but breaths held tight. Maya bit her lip until it bled, but she stayed upright. Her eyes welled with tears that hadn't yet fallen, as if straining to protect the last remains of her pride. And then Kane sneered, lowering his voice into an icy sentence, each word cutting through the air. "I'll teach you how to stay quiet." He raised his baton, the glint of metal flashing under the lights, his figure looming as if to swallow the small girl before him. That moment stretched endlessly. All sound vanished except for the thump of Maya's heartbeat echoed by the hearts of the breathless students. They knew what was coming, but no one moved. They were bound by fear, by the authority Kane carried like a weapon. And as the baton hissed through the air, the truth came clear. Not all wounds come from distant enemies. Some are dealt by those in uniform sworn to protect. Maya stood there, legs trembling but unbent, heart caged in a small chest, but not yet conquered. Kane brought the baton down, and the hallway exploded in frozen terror and suffocated outrage. Screams caught in the throats of the students before they could escape, and from that moment on, Maya's story was no longer hers alone. It had become a spark ready to ignite an eruption that the entire system would be forced to face. The hallway, already thick with tension, grew more suffocating as dozens of phones were raised, blue and red lights from their cameras flickering against the pale white walls. The students crowded into a half circle, some raising their arms high to capture everything, others filming with trembling hands, their footage shaky, but still focused on Officer Kane and Maya Thompson. In that moment, the school was no longer a place of learning, but a silent courtroom where every student was a witness, and every breath held back felt like a suppressed testimony. Kane stood directly in front of Maya, his eyes bloodshot, his hand gripping the baton so tightly his knuckles turned white, as if all restraint had finally snapped into uncontrollable madness. Maya stepped back half a pace, her back brushing the wall, the rough old paint scratching her skin through her thin shirt. The wall felt like a metal trap, closing in, forcing her into a corner with no escape. Footsteps scraped behind her, and whispers mixed with the urgent sounds of dry swallowing. Kane moved in closer, his shadow engulfing her slight frame, and then his shout erupted sharp and explosive like a gunshot in the air. "Bo, your head! Didn't you hear me?" Each word slashed like a blade, making Maya's chest tremble. The crowd flinched, many students shrinking down, some bowing their heads as if the command had been aimed at them. But Maya's gaze held firm, trembling yet lit with one last flicker of defiance, the kind of light Kane despised most because it proved fear hadn't won. In a moment that felt frozen, Maya shouted back, her voice cracked but sharp, cutting through the strangled space. "I have the right to stand tall." Her protest wasn't just the words of a 17-year-old girl. It rang like a bell against the cowardly silence of the crowd, pierced the air sharp and out of place, stabbing at the pride of the man who held all the power. The students shuddered, some with eyes full of angry tears, some with hands trembling as they pressed record faster, knowing this moment would become undeniable evidence. But just as her scream still echoed, the baton in Kane's hand sliced through the air with a dry, chilling hiss like a blade swung down. All eyes widened, breaths caught in throats, and then a heavy sound cracked as metal struck flesh. Maya staggered, her body tipping sideways, hair flung loose, the book slipping from her hand and hitting the tile floor. A deep red streak spread across her forehead, sliding down her pale face. The scene tore through the room like a scream, forcing everyone to confront the brutal injustice laid bare air before them. The blood on Maya's face was proof no excuse could hide what had just happened. Heavy breathing spread across the hallway, whispers turned into choked gasps, and a few sobs broke out from the far corner. A student in the crowd, eyes red and swollen, suddenly screamed, voice cracking from shock, "She's just a student!" The cry echoed down the corridor, bouncing off every wall, but no one stepped forward to stop it. Everyone stood frozen feet glued to the floor, as if moving even a single step closer might make them the next target. Phones continued recording shaky frames, capturing the blood dripping onto the white tile floor, the way Maya's eyes were clenched shut in pain and the cold indifference carved into Kane's face. Maya collapsed her hands, reaching for the ground, but her body was too weak to hold itself up. The baton clattered against the floor once more as Kane loosened his grip, as if he had gotten exactly what he came for. His eyes looked down, filled with disdain, more cutting than rage, the look of someone who believed he had just stamped another mark of power onto a defenseless body. The air was so thick it felt like it could be sliced, and the students surrounding them swallowed their fear hands, clenching their phones, some shaken so hard they nearly dropped them, but still couldn't look away. The hallway was filled with repressed outrage, but fear held it prisoner, sealing off any path to resistance. In Maya's subconscious, every sound seemed to fade away. She heard the scream, "She's just a student," but it felt distant, echoing from a place far removed. Her head spun, her vision blurred, and flickers of white light danced in her eyes. The metallic scent of blood rose, mixing with the stale cigarette smoke still lingering in Kane's breath, twisted her stomach in knots. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her body refused. The faces around her, blurred like fading shadows, distorted by fear, eyes reddened, but no one reached out to catch her. A crushing loneliness gripped Maya's heart, and the shame boiled into silent tears that mixed with the stream of blood. Kane straightened, exhaling like a man who had just finished venting his fury. He glanced around, his eyes daring anyone to speak. No one said a word. No one dared move closer. A heavy silence settled over everything, broken only by the quiet drip of blood hitting the cold tile floor. Kane's black shoes stepped into the blood, leaving dark red footprints trailing down the hallway. He turned to walk away, took one step, then stopped, glanced back at Maya, collapsed on the ground, and let a cold smile curl the edge of his lips, a smile that sent a chill through every student watching. Scattered sobs rose up, but were quickly suppressed. Those still filming kept their phones raised, hands shaking, eyes wide open, no one willing to miss this brutal moment in history. A few whispered, "We have to get this video out," but lowered their heads just as quickly, afraid because Kane was still nearby. In the eyes of the crowd, there was both helplessness and a fragile hope that one day this scene would become evidence, the beginning of a quake strong enough to shake a system built to shield cruelty. At the very center of that silent circle, Maya lay, collapsed on the ground, her breath faint, blood spreading into a long streak across the floor. Her young heart beat slower and slower, but on her pale, trembling lips still clung the bitterness of words left unsaid. And Kane, with slow, deliberate steps, walked away from the heart of the tragedy like a man victorious, leaving behind a blood-stained hallway and dozens of eyes that had never witnessed such a raw and brutal truth. The school's medical room that morning felt nothing like it ever had before. No longer just a place where students came for a bandage or a painkiller, it had become a temporary shelter for a body crushed by brutality. The door swung open as two medical staff rushed in, pushing a stretcher across the white tile floor. Maya Thompson lay motionless, her face pale blood from her forehead staining the pillow in dark red blooms. The air was thick with antiseptic mixed with fresh blood, so heavy that anyone entering the room had to hold their breath. Students crowded outside the doorway, whispering rapidly, but all went silent the moment Officer Kane's imposing shadow appeared at the threshold. In that already cramped space, Kane's towering presence consumed everything. He stepped inside, eyes sweeping the room like someone who felt no need to explain, certain that his authority alone was enough to smother any questions. He lifted his chin and spoke in a dry, flat voice, void of remorse. She resisted. I followed the procedure. The words dropped into the room like a heavy stone, crushing any hope that he might admit wrongdoing. The medical staff kept wiping blood from Maya's forehead, their hands trembling, but no one dared to look up. One cut the blood-soaked hair away with scissors. Another placed an oxygen tube in her mouth, the chill of it filling the space, but every movement was quiet, met with absolute silence. In that dense atmosphere, a middle-aged teacher who had witnessed the hallway incident stood pale as if sleepless for days, murmuring almost to himself, "But she's just a child." His voice, unsteady and barely audible, was like a faint light slipping through a narrow crack, but that light was extinguished immediately. Kane turned his head, his eyes sharp as blades slicing through the teacher. That threatening stare made the man flinch, his chest heaving, throat tight as if gripped by an invisible hand. He closed his mouth, bit his lip, and stepped back like someone who had just spoken forbidden words. The room sank into a silence so dense that the beeping of Maya's heart monitor echoed like funeral drums. In a corner, Officer Briggs leaned against the wall, arms hanging at his sides, eyes fixed on the floor. He had seen it all, from Kane's shouting to the blow that dropped Maya, and now he watched the blood continue to spread. Yet not a single word left his mouth. His eyes occasionally flicked toward the girl's still body just for a second, then darted away again as if lingering too long might stir his conscience. Briggs chose silence, a silence like a mask hiding fear and cowardice. In that avoiding gaze, there wasn't just helplessness, there was complicity. Maya's heart monitor beeped steadily, each sound stabbing into the hearts of those watching. Her eyelids were tightly shut, her face ghostly pale, breathing short and heavy. The medical staff placed another gauze pad on her wound, but the blood kept soaking through, bright red and relentless. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye, trailing down her cheek and landing on the sheet, mixing with the blood and leaving a bitter trace. That tear felt like a silent accusation, a voiceless plea for help meant for everyone present. But no one bent down to receive it. No one had the courage to say what was happening was wrong. Outside, the hallway was packed with students. Some gripped their friends' hands so tightly their nails cut into skin. Some buried their faces in their shoulders and cried, and others whispered prayers begging Maya to open her eyes. But no one stepped in. No one crossed the threshold of fear. They stared through the door's cracked eyes, red and swollen feet frozen in place. One look from Kane was enough for them to know they could be next. Kane still stood there watching silently. He knew he had already won, not because he brought down a girl, but because he had silenced the entire room. No one dared protest. No one dared meet his eyes. That silence was the clearest proof of the power he held. "I followed procedure," he said again, voice calm as if describing a routine task, as if that procedure was a shield that could protect him from every accusation. Briggs took a deep breath, eyes still fixed on the floor, trying to convince himself that staying quiet was the safest choice. But that silence turned him into an accomplice, part of the system that allowed this cruelty to exist. The teacher who had spoken now lowered his face, heart pounding in his chest but lips sealed tight. The medical staff kept working with trembling hands stained in blood, but none of them said a word in defense. The air in the room was so thick that every breath echoed, every small movement seemed deafening. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting a cold blue-white glow across Maya's lifeless face, making her look like a body without a soul. That silence weighed more than any scream because it proved fear had won, that everyone present had chosen to turn away from the truth. Kane glanced around one last time, a faint smirk crossing his face, the smirk of someone who knew that even without batons or shouting, he could still make the entire room go silent. Briggs kept his head down, the teacher stepped further back, and the medical staff worked in quiet submission. Maya lay there, breath shallow, face pale, a living testament to the violence that had just taken place. And in that heavy silence, the cowardice of everyone watching echoed louder than Kane's voice in the hallway. The local hospital that morning felt even more somber than usual. The long hallway was drenched in harsh white light from fluorescent bulbs reflecting off the worn blue tile floors, making the space feel sterile and unfeeling. The screech of gurney wheels echoed against the walls, blending with the dry metallic voice of the intercom, turning the hospital into something more like a frozen maze than a place of healing. The emergency room doors burst open as figures in white coats moved quickly past each one in a rush. And then Evelyn Thompson appeared. She rushed forward, face-stricken hair, disheveled eyes swollen and red from crying. Her heart clenched as she saw her daughter being wheeled in unconscious, red streaks of blood still staining her forehead and collar. Evelyn's scream rang down the hallway, the scream of a mother having the most precious part of her life torn away. She charged into the room, ignoring the medical staff trying to hold her back. "Maya, answer me, baby." Her voice ripped through the air like a funeral bell in broad daylight. Evelyn's trembling hands grasped her daughter's thin arm, trying to shake her awake to pull her soul back into her body. But Maya did not respond. Her breath was shallow, her eyes closed, her body still under the harsh surgical lights. Evelyn collapsed into the chair beside the bed, tears pouring down her face. She stared at her daughter's pale lips, her delicate nose so familiar, yet now frozen like a statue. 1,000 questions stormed through her mind. Why did her child go to school only to return like this? How had a place called a school become a battlefield, and why had the ones sworn to protect turned their hands against an innocent child? Doctors and nurses moved swiftly around them, voices overlapping with urgency. But Evelyn heard none of it. Her ears buzzed with the sound of her own heartbeat and the beeping of Maya's heart monitor. Her hands shook as she gently touched her daughter's hair, once soft and smooth, from morning brushes now sticky and matted with blood. Evelyn felt herself plummet into a void filled with rage, helplessness, and despair. In that moment, all she could do was cry out her daughter's name over and over, her voice breaking, praying for a miracle. The door burst open again. Heavy footsteps echoed in the room, and Evelyn looked up. There he was, Officer Kane. The officer walked in with no urgency, his face, cold eyes, unmoved by the blood before him. The medical staff flinched slightly, and a few looked like they might speak, but stopped themselves, quietly stepping aside. Kane walked closer, hands in his pockets, carrying the air of a man without guilt. He stopped beside the hospital bed, glanced at Maya's unmoving body, then turned to Evelyn and spoke in a flat metallic tone. "If you know what's good for you, sign the settlement. Pretend it never happened." Those words hit Evelyn like a slap to the face. She looked up at Kane, eyes still filled with tears, now burning with a different kind of fire. Just seconds ago, she had been a desperate mother. Now that desperation had turned into a force that screamed from within. Evelyn wiped her tears with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and forced her shattered heart to harden. She rose to her feet, walked straight up to Kane, and spoke, her voice hoarse but firm. Each word scraped from the bottom of her soul. "You hit my daughter, and you will regret it for the rest of your life." The sentence dropped like a curse, freezing the air around them. Evelyn's eyes lit up like blades, no longer the swollen, helpless gaze of a grieving mother, but the stare of someone who had found a reason to stand. Kane let out a faint mocking smile, but for a brief moment his eyes faltered, caught off guard by the sheer resolve burning in the woman before him. A mother who had shed her softness, replacing it with cold, clear fury. Evelyn didn't scream, didn't shake. She spoke as if carving a vow into the room itself. The room fell silent again, broken only by the long, steady beeps of Maya's heart monitor, each beat like a drum signaling a battle about to begin. The medical staff stepped aside, silent but visibly shaken. They had seen many emergencies, many injuries, but never a mother this broken yet unyielding. Evelyn stood there, gripping her daughter's hand, her gaze locked on the man who caused it all. From that moment Each gust of wind carried a strange chill, as if eyes were staring from somewhere deep in the night. The nurse gave a slight nod, his face grave, then slipped out quickly, leaving Evelyn with a new sense of unease. She drew in a long breath, the cold air clearing her mind. She understood then Kane's appearance that morning wasn't a reckless act, it was a warning that from now on every move she made would be watched. The nurse's words had only confirmed what she already knew. Evelyn lifted her head and stared directly into the dark where the curtains shifted. Fear rose inside her, but it didn't consume her. It was soon drowned out by something sharper, something stronger, resolve. She leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead, her lips meeting skin chilled and scented with antiseptic, then sat upright, her eyes stealing with a new fire. By day, she had been a grieving mother, broken and weeping. But tonight she had become another version of herself, one forged by pain into strength. Evelyn knew the battle ahead wouldn't be against one man, but against an entire system that had allowed violence to thrive. And she wouldn't move forward on tears, she would move forward on determination. The night dragged on, but Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat by Maya's bed, listening to the mechanical breath of the ventilator, to the cold, steady beeps that seemed to echo every promise she had made. "I won't let them get away with this." She whispered it again and again, her voice growing firmer each time. Every time she gripped Maya's hand, she felt her own blood surge, saw flashes of her daughter smiling again, innocent as before. Those memories became her light, guiding her, keeping her from falling into the abyss. Outside the window, the night was pitch black, the wind howling in bursts across the rooftop. But inside the small hospital room, a fire had been lit. That fire wasn't meant to warm her alone. It was there to light the way for an unyielding journey. Evelyn knew she wasn't just a mother protecting her daughter. She stood at the edge of something greater, ready to turn her personal pain into a voice for all those who had been and would be trampled. Her eyes burned bright in the darkness, no longer the eyes of someone defeated, but of someone who had found purpose. Evelyn slowly lifted her head, took a deep breath, and spoke again, her whisper rising like a curse. "You will not suffer for nothing. I will make them pay for all of it." In the cold stillness of the hospital room, that vow etched itself into the space around them, becoming an invisible thread that bound her to Maya, a force strong enough to make the darkness outside no longer frightening. The student dormitory of a local university was more brightly lit than usual that night. In a small room on the 4th floor, the glow of a phone screen lit up the face of a young male student, his eyes filled with panic and determination. He was the one who had stood trembling in the hallway that morning, risking everything to record Officer Kane yelling at and then striking Maya Thompson. All day, he had hesitated, replaying in his mind the image of blood spraying from Maya's forehead, the screams of the students, and Kane's violent glare. He knew releasing the clip would change everything, maybe bring danger, but keeping it hidden would mean bearing the truth alongside the blood of an innocent girl. His hands shook as he opened the TikTok app. The screen showed a trimmed video cut to just the core seconds. His heart pounded, sweat breaking across his forehead despite the ceiling fan spinning above. He took a deep breath and tapped post. In that instant, a small sound left his chest as if a weight had lifted. He dropped into the chair, eyes locked on the spinning upload icon. Then the clip was live and the first image appeared, Kane, screaming, his voice blasting from the phone speaker, "Stay down!" The rasp in his voice, cruel and cutting, cracked through the screen like a whip. Seconds later, the baton swung down, Maya collapsed to the tile floor, blood spreading, and the frame shook from the filmer's trembling hands. The video lasted less than 10 seconds, but it carried unbearable weight. In the world of social media, a few short seconds could ignite thousands of hearts. Those who saw it first couldn't believe their eyes. They replayed it, then instantly hit share. Comments flooded in, short but heavy as iron. God, this is the police. She's just a student. Who let him do this? The clip spread from one student's modest account to dozens, then hundreds, then thousands in under an hour. In another hospital room, Evelyn Thompson sat quietly beside her daughter's bed. Her phone had buzzed a few times, but she'd ignored it, too exhausted to care, until a young nurse leaned in and whispered, "There's a video of Maya online." Evelyn froze, then grabbed her phone. Her fingers shook as she tapped play. Just a few seconds, but it crushed her. She saw Kane clearly on screen, his face flushed, his eyes blazing with contempt, and his voice yelling, "Stay down," hitting her like a blow. Then the baton struck, and Maya collapsed, blood spilling. Evelyn trembled, her tears close, but she bit her lip, hard eyes fixed on the screen. She took a deep breath, then made up her mind to act. Without hesitation, Evelyn left a comment under the clip. Her hands trembled, but the pen of truth never strayed. She typed each word short and sharp. "That's my daughter." The comment appeared right below the video, 3 simple words that struck like lightning across the internet. Viewers froze, then flooded in with replies. "Oh my God, it's really her mother. Unbelievable. We have to do something now." The truth was no longer just blurry footage. It had been sealed with the mother's confirmation. Within hours, the clip spread at breakneck speed. Thousands of shares, hundreds of thousands of views, the numbers climbing by the minute. The hashtag #Justice4 Maya emerged first, typed by a few users, then swelling into a movement. Each time someone hit share, they added the hashtag like raising a flag. In no time, the clip jumped from TikTok to Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Screenshots of Maya collapsing quotes of the words, "She's just a student," from a student's scream circulated widely, engraving the accusation deep into the minds of everyone watching. In the student dorm, the young man who posted the video sat frozen, staring at his phone. The screen lit up again and again with thousands of notifications. He had never imagined the video would explode this fast. Part of him was scared, afraid he'd be found out, that Kane or his allies would come for him. But another part felt relieved, like a weight had finally lifted. He knew the truth was out now, and no one could force it back into the dark. Across the city, a group of young people gathered at a cafe watching the same clip. They shouted, fists slamming the table, eyes blazing. "We can't let this go." One of them went live on the spot, playing the clip, sharing the story, and urging others to speak up. Hundreds watched in real time, then shared it, spreading the outrage. Online posts flooded in. "Maya is our daughter's age. This is violence, not protection. Stand with Evelyn." Back at the hospital, Evelyn kept watching. She didn't just see the clip, she saw a digital wildfire. She saw thousands of strangers sharing her pain and turning it into collective fury. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but her gaze was fiercer than ever. She knew now she wasn't alone. Every share, every angry comment was a strike against the shield Kane and his accomplices were hiding behind. As the hours passed, the hashtag #Justice for Maya spilled beyond the local scene. Journalists began to take notice, sharing the clip with searing questions. Where is justice when a student is beaten by someone meant to protect? On forums, people debated the story, and the image of Maya lying unconscious became a symbol of injustice. Someone paired her photo with bold text, "She needed books, not bruises." The image was shared tens of thousands of times, turning Maya from a victim into a symbol. The hospital was quiet, but online a storm was gathering. Evelyn read each comment, saw her daughter's name echoed everywhere. She gripped Maya's hand tighter and whispered, "You see, the whole world is standing with you." Her heart was still heavy with pain, but in her eyes a flicker of hope had returned. Not hope that Maya would wake up right away, but hope that her daughter's voice would not be buried. That clip had opened the door, and through that door the truth was stepping into the light. That morning, The central square, normally filled with leisurely walkers and children playing beneath the monument's shadow, had become something entirely different. From early on, waves of people arrived, their faces marked with tension. In their hands were handmade signs hastily written but charged with power. The chill of the morning air was overtaken by the heat of anger radiating from hundreds gathered together. Footsteps, voices, and the clack of wooden signs bumping together blended into a low-rising rumble like waves approaching shore. Parents led their children by the hand, faces tense but resolute, their eyes reflecting the quiet terror that one day their child could be the next Maya. High school students stood shoulder to shoulder, some live streaming with shaky hands, their faces still young but their eyes burning red. Simple slogans were scrawled in marker across cardboard: protect kids, not beat them. She's not a criminal, she's a kid. A thin girl held up the second sign with both small hands, her eyes filled with outrage. That phrase was quickly repeated by those around her, then spread across the entire square. The voices of children rose, blending with parents, college students, and teachers, forming a furious chorus. Their unified chants echoed off the old buildings around the square, down alleyways, and into windows along every block. On the stone steps of the central monument, a group of student volunteers shouted through megaphones, voices hoarse but strong. We stand here for Maya, but not just for Maya. We stand for every student so they can go to school without fearing a baton from a cop. The crowd responded in waves, one chant crashing into the next. People began stomping their feet against the stone ground, the pounding like war drums. Some students shouted while crying, their hot tears mixing with cracked, shouted slogans. A few gripped each other's hands, tightly trembling as they yelled, pouring all their fear and fury into every word. Journalists filled the square, cameras sweeping to catch every face, every sign, every tear. The crowd surged around one spot when a woman stood up. It was Evelyn. She wore a plain coat, her face hollowed from sleepless nights, but her eyes were fierce. When handed a microphone, Evelyn didn't cry. She stood tall, her voice clear, each word slicing through the air. My daughter went to school, not to a war zone. That sentence cut through every sound, freezing the square for a moment. It didn't just speak of Maya. It exposed a raw truth. A child walked into school with books and walked out with wounds and blood. That mother didn't plead with tears, she condemned with truth. The statement was captured by dozens of cameras, broadcast live on television and social media. Viewers at home fell silent in front of their screens, while in the square, after a few seconds of stunned stillness, the crowd erupted like a storm. People shouted Maya's name, clapped until their palms burned, stomped their feet against the stone ground, unleashing a tremor from deep within the public's heart. Meanwhile, in the cold meeting room of the police department, the chief of police appeared on television with a stern face and a scripted voice. He sat upright, composed in his uniform, and said, "This was merely an unfortunate misunderstanding. We are conducting an investigation and ask the public to remain calm and not let emotions override reason." His words echoed across screens, but instead of calming tensions, they poured fuel on the fire. Out in the square, hundreds of eyes locked onto the large screen mounted on the city hall. Then came the roar of boos. A father raised a sign and shouted, "What kind of misunderstanding leaves my daughter bleeding on a classroom floor?" A male student, tears welling in his eyes, held a microphone with trembling hands and asked, "If that was a misunderstanding, what do you call the blood on the tiles?" These questions cracked like thunder, shattering the empty rhetoric. The crowd erupted again, some hurled water bottles, the shatter of plastic exploding into chants of protest. On screen, the chief remained composed, but against the wall of screams outside, his image felt distant, cold, and meaningless. Evelyn stepped onto the stone steps and raised her hand. The crowd gradually quieted, eyes turning to her. She looked straight into the lens, her eyes burning, and spoke not loudly but carried by the silence of thousands. They call it a misunderstanding, but I'm sitting in a hospital holding the hand of my unconscious daughter. What kind of misunderstanding leaves her motionless beneath a ventilator? If they want us silent, then I'll tell you now I will not be silent, and I believe you won't either. In that moment, the square exploded. Chants of justice for Maya thundered across, echoing from one end to the other like a tidal wave crashing through. Hands rose, tears fell, faces burned with conviction. Cameras swept across the scene, capturing Evelyn, standing among the crowd, an image that spread across phone screens, live broadcasts, and headline after headline. People no longer saw her as one woman. They saw her as the voice of an entire community demanding justice. By afternoon, as the sun tilted west, the square was still packed. New slogans had been hastily written on sheets of white paper, the handwriting messy but firm. We won't forget Maya and police violence. Reporters, their voices breaking with emotion, called it a historic moment. People in cafes, corner stores, and small apartments sat glued to their screens, their hearts beating in sync with the crowd outside. Maya's pain was no longer a family's private grief. It had become a shared sorrow, transformed into a wave of outrage spreading beyond the city's borders. In the days following the protest in the central square, the fire of outrage didn't fade. It spread like a wind-driven blaze. From quiet streets in small towns to the traffic-choked avenues of major cities, crowds marched in unison, raising signs and shouting chants everyone now knew by heart. The signs, reading "Justice for Maya," became a familiar sight, not just in one region, but across the entire country. Every footstep on concrete, every echoing chant in the heart of the city served as a reminder that justice cannot be buried in silence. National media began devoting significant coverage, showing images of massive crowds filling entire boulevards, carrying a collective anger that had grown far beyond one small community. While public pressure surged, a secondary video clip suddenly surfaced online. It was only a few seconds long, but its impact hit like a bomb dropped into an already volatile atmosphere. The footage captured the moment right after Kane struck Maya with his baton. He turned away, not a flicker of remorse on his face, but instead a smirk of mockery. The audio was faint, but clear enough to hear him say, "Another thug put down." Those 4 words, cold and venomous, instantly added fuel to the flames. This was no longer just about a violent act. It was proof of the contempt embedded in someone meant to uphold the law. As soon as the clip spread, social media exploded. Tens of thousands of comments flooded in within minutes. People quoted Kane's words in quotation marks and added the same burning question: who gave him the right to act like an executioner? That line repeated across every platform like a collective indictment from an entire society. Someone posted a photo of their child in a school uniform with the caption, "If tomorrow my child gets called a thug because of their skin, who will protect them?" Others paired images of Maya in her hospital bed, Kane's smirking face written in bold, "This is not protection. This is cruelty." Those images spread rapidly, making the outrage visible, impossible to ignore or deny. Major news outlets joined in publishing long-form pieces analyzing not just the incident but the system that enabled such abuse of power. National broadcasts replayed the clip dozens of times, their commentators visibly shaken voices, trembling with fury. This is no longer just Maya's story. This is a wake-up call for the entire nation. More and more people took to the streets from the East Coast to the West, with drums and horns, walking through rain and sun, fueled by a rage that was now indistinguishable from love. Amid the storm of public outrage, prominent figures began to speak out. Top singers posted messages with the hashtag #JusticeForMaya, along with short videos urging millions of fans not to remain indifferent. A famous actor reposted the clip, writing, "We cannot let our children grow up fearing those in uniform." A basketball player posted a photo of his sneakers with the word Maya handwritten across them, promising to dedicate his next game in her honor. Each act, however small, added another brick to the wall of resistance, helping the wave of fury spread even further. Then, a new question began surfacing across social media. Who is her mom? It started as simple curiosity, but quickly turned into a trend. People didn't just want to know about Maya, they wanted to know the woman who had stood tall in the square declaring that her daughter had gone to school, not to war. The hashtag, #WhoIsHerMom, began appearing everywhere, spreading like wildfire through dry grass. Every post, every shared thought included the tag, turning it into a collective mystery that the whole country wanted to solve. Entertainment news outlets, usually filled with celebrity gossip, started posting Evelyn's image. They resurfaced the short clip where she had said with a voice like steel, "I will not be silent," and commented, "She's not just a mother." Short articles and edited videos circulated widely featuring the moment Evelyn stood before the crowd, raised her hand to call for silence, then spoke with unwavering clarity. People began giving her new names: the Iron Mother, the Torch of Justice, the woman who shook the system. In the hospital, Evelyn watched it all unfold with a complex expression. She saw the clip of Kane smiling, heard his cruel words, and felt another dagger pierce her heart. But then she opened her phone and saw millions of people shouting alongside her, saw the hashtag about her rising across platforms, and she smiled softly through tears. Holding Maya's hand, she whispered, "See, sweetheart, they're asking about your mother. They'll know, and I'll give them the answer." The marches only grew larger. In New York, Times Square lit up with giant screens replaying the clip, "Justice for Maya," glowing like the city's battle cry. In Los Angeles, a line of marchers stretched for miles. Saxophones played mournful tunes from street performers, turning the protest into a haunting symphony. In Chicago, thousands in raincoats stomped and chanted through pouring rain. These scenes were streamed live, flooding social media feeds and transforming outrage into a relentless current running through the nation. No one could dismiss this as a small-town incident anymore. No one could hide behind excuses or deflect with hollow statements. The evidence was undeniable, and the outrage had turned into collective strength. And rising above it all was the name Maya Thompson, with the name Evelyn Thompson slowly coming into focus. The nation was no longer a silent audience, it had become a participant, a companion in the fight. The fire had spread beyond one family, one city, and was now burning through the false veneer covering the entire system. That evening, the entire nation held its breath watching a live television broadcast. The studio was bright under powerful lights, the audience seats packed, and millions sat in front of their screens waiting. The anchor opened with a warm but tense voice, recalling the now viral footage of Maya Thompson, then introduced the guest everyone had been waiting for. When the door at the back of the studio opened, Evelyn stepped out into complete silence, the atmosphere so heavy that every sound was swallowed. She wore a simple coat, her posture weary from sleepless nights still evident, but her radiant eyes made her the undeniable center of attention impossible to look away from. Taking her seat, Evelyn didn't look around. She sat upright, her hands clasped in her lap. Dozens of camera lenses pointed directly at her face, but she didn't flinch. The host took a deep breath and asked the question the entire country had been waiting to hear. "Please tell us who you are." The air went still. Millions of eyes were fixed on their screens. Evelyn raised her head, her voice clear and steady, each word weighted like heavy stones placed on solid ground. "I'm Maya's mother, and I was a senior advisor to the Human Rights Commission." The sentence cut through the silence like a blade. The studio erupted into stunned gasps, audience members murmured in shock, and the host sat speechless for a moment. On a live broadcast, social media exploded. Thousands of comments poured in at once, questions, cheers, outbursts so fast they overwhelmed the feed. The hashtag #WhoIsHerMom instantly transformed into #WeKnowHer. now spreading like wildfire. People clipped the moment, overlaying Evelyn's words onto footage of her raising her hand among the crowd, calling her the new face of truth and justice. Evelyn didn't stop at the introduction. She stared directly into the camera, her eyes a mix of pain and determination, and continued in a calm but cutting tone, "I know the law. I spent years protecting human rights. And today, after my daughter was beaten unconscious at school, I realize justice is no longer just dry text on paper, it's a matter of survival. I will use everything I know, everything I've lived, and even my life, if I must, to protect Maya, and to protect every other child." The studio fell silent. The host nodded repeatedly, but didn't interrupt. Audience members were tearing up, some stood and began to applaud, and soon the clapping spread, swelling into a long, thunderous ovation that drowned out the host's voice. In that moment, the woman who had once worked quietly behind the scene now stood in front of the public, transformed into a blazing flame. Evelyn had moved beyond her private grief to become the symbol of a storm tearing apart the old facades. And right then, the nation understood this was no longer just about a single incident. It was the beginning of a long fight with Evelyn at its heart. The moment Evelyn confirmed her identity, the air in the studio seemed to vanish. Every whisper from the audience disappeared, and the harsh studio lights no longer felt noisy, but instead lit up the stunned faces, frozen in disbelief. The host, usually composed even in tense political interviews, was so shaken he couldn't form the next question. The microphone in his hand trembled slightly, his eyes darting between Evelyn and the camera as if he himself couldn't believe what had just been said. Behind the scenes, the entire crew held their breath. A technician's hand hovered over the control board, unmoving, no one daring to interrupt a moment they all knew would become part of television history. Evelyn remained sitting tall, her gaze steady, a faint smile appearing as a silent challenge to anyone who had ever doubted her strength. Outside the studio, the response was immediate and explosive. Just seconds after the live broadcast, social media was flooded with clips of Evelyn's revelation. Users froze the frame on her radiant eyes and added bold text, "She's not just a mom." Thousands of shares followed, creating a tidal wave. Viewers weren't just shocked, they felt empowered. Those once filled with rage now found an anchor. A mother no longer just a victim, but a warrior stepping out from behind political curtains. Forums lit up with discussions. One user wrote, "Now I understand why she was so calm. She knows the law, she knows the system, and she knows how to bring it down." Another said, "This isn't just a family's fight anymore, it's ours." The hashtag, "She's not just a mom," spread with lightning speed. Evelyn's image was paired with symbols of justice. Some turned it into propaganda-style posters, and others made it their phone wallpaper. In schools, teachers and students replayed the video during class meetings, cheering loudly every time her words echoed. In cafes, wall-mounted screens showed the clip, and customers paused mid-conversation to listen, breaking into applause. In offices, employees discreetly watched on their phones, whispering that they had never seen a mother so powerful. The impact didn't stop at the national level. International news outlets quickly published translated versions of Evelyn's speech, calling her the woman who turned pain into a weapon. The image of her standing tall under the studio lights, her eyes shining like blades cutting through the darkness, appeared on the front pages of many digital newspapers. Overseas communities joined in organizing prayer vigils and public speeches declaring that Maya and Evelyn's story had become a global symbol. Amid this explosion, the local government felt the mounting pressure. They were no longer facing a lone mother, but a movement that now had a face, a symbol, and a spiritual leader. For ordinary people from that moment on, they knew they were not alone. Evelyn had stepped out of the shadows of personal grief to become a guiding flame, and the phrase, "She's not just a mom," was no longer just a trending slogan. It became a collective oath, a reminder that a mother pushed to the edge could become a force powerful enough to shake an entire system. That morning, the hospital gates were packed. News vans lined up, antennas raised, while a swarm of reporters crowded the entrance, microphones and cameras aimed directly at the main walkway. Sunlight reflected off their lenses, making the entire area flare with a blinding, cold brilliance. Curious citizens gathered behind barricades, phones raised, every face marked with anticipation. The crowd pulsed like a living tide, every whisper, every glance fixed on one point, the place where Evelyn Thompson was about to appear. When the heavy doors opened, Evelyn stepped out, her frame thin but unshaken, her face, weary from sleepless nights, still glowing under the floodlights. Cameras clicked relentlessly, microphones pushed close to her face. Evelyn paused at the top of the stairs, unflinching, her eyes scanning the crowd with a look both stern and resolute. The air thickened. Reporters fell silent. Thousands waited. Then her voice rang out, sharp and steady, each word carved into the atmosphere. "They beat my daughter into a coma. I will tear this system down." In that instant, the crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, and choked sobs echoed through the courtyard. Reporters scrambled to capture her words. Phone screens lit up. Social media feeds flooded instantly with her declaration, "I will tear this system down." No one expected a grieving mother to speak with such force. Her words were not just a cry of maternal anguish, they were a challenge hurled at those hiding behind power. Among the onlookers, many faces shimmered with tears. A middle-aged woman wiped her eyes and told her son, "That's real strength." A group of students held up hastily written signs, "We stand with Evelyn." They chanted her name, the sound bouncing off the cold concrete walls, transforming into a resounding roar. The media broadcast the moment live, Evelyn standing firm in a forest of microphones, becoming the nation's new focal point. In another room, officials watched the live footage, their faces drawn tight. They knew her words weren't aimed at just one person, they targeted the entire machinery. Some scrambled to draft press releases to calm the storm, but Evelyn's conviction had already pushed the situation beyond their control. Her declaration was becoming a public weapon, turning private pain into a collective banner. In that moment, standing before the hospital, Evelyn was no longer just a mother sitting by her daughter's bedside. She had become the embodiment of resistance. Every eye turned to her was filled with trust. Every raised hand felt like a vow to follow her to the end. The air was thick with tension, but within it a sense of belief was taking shape, a belief that from this moment on, truth would no longer be buried, and justice would finally have a name. Evelyn descended the steps, walking straight through a forest of cameras, but her words still echoed, becoming a fire that burned through silence and planted in thousands a determination they had never known before. Immediately after Evelyn's fierce declaration rang out, the square in front of the hospital erupted like a volcano. The chant, "Justice for Maya," thundered through the airwaves, a sound rising from thousands of voices, merging with the beat of drums, the blare of horns, the banging on railings and signs, creating a furious anthem of defiance. Raised hands, hastily written signs, and tears spilling alongside unified cries fused into the force of a crowd no longer afraid. Cameras swung in every direction, capturing faces, brimming with belief, the fury transforming into searing heat. Not only you have grandparents, elders, everyone joined their voices, turning the chant into a triumphant chorus. Reporters jostled to stream live the phrase, "Justice for Maya," glowing across screens nationwide. Edited clips showing the crowd with hands raised, voices booming, were shared online, flooding every platform within hours. People watching from far away couldn't help but be drawn in. They wept, they chanted from their living rooms as if they stood shoulder to shoulder with the crowd. Cafes aired the live coverage, customers rising from their seats to join in. The image of people from all walks of life united in the name of justice became a historic moment. From the steps, Evelyn looked down, eyes brimming with tears, but the roar from thousands became her strength, transforming her into the flame at the center of the blaze. Elsewhere, inside a rundown apartment, the glow of a television screen lit up Kane's face. He sat slumped in a chair, bloodshot eyes fixed on the live broadcast of Evelyn. The chant, "Justice for Maya," echoed from the screen, boiling his blood. His hand trembled around a glass cup, veins bulging as his grip tightened. When Evelyn repeated her vow with unshakable clarity, the crowd responded with thunderous cries. Kane let out a growl from deep in his throat and hurled the glass to the floor. It shattered on impact, shards flying in every direction, the sharp crack of breaking glass slicing through the stillness of the room. He clenched his teeth, face contorted with rage, his voice spilling out like a growl from someone who'd just been challenged. "That woman won't dare." The words escaped, but even he could feel the tremor in his own heart. The image of Evelyn and the sea of people outside the hospital haunted him, turning that sentence into more of a reassurance to himself than a threat. Kane sprang to his feet, pacing the room like a wounded animal, eyes fierce, but unable to mask the unease. The chant, "Justice for Maya," still echoed from the screen, pounding in his ears, each syllable a strike against his pride. And in that room, scattered with shattered glass for the first time, Kane understood that the woman he had dismissed was becoming an opponent powerful enough to make him lose control. The next morning, at the gray stone building of the district attorney's office, the usually quiet atmosphere turned unusually busy. The hallway was packed with reporters, cameras raised, high questions fired from all directions. Evelyn Thompson appeared, walking beside her was a young attorney with a serious face clutching a briefcase tightly. Though thin, Evelyn's posture was steady, and her eyes were blazing, not just with personal grief anymore, but with the determination to bring truth into the light. As the heavy wooden doors to the DA's office swung open, every lens followed, capturing the image of the woman and her lawyer stepping forward as if carrying the weight of a revolution. Inside the conference room, the air was quieter, yellow light from the ceiling lamp cast down onto the long wooden table. The lead prosecutor sat at the head, a stack of blank folders in front of him, waiting to be filled. Evelyn and the lawyer sat across, the tension palpable. But Evelyn's voice when she began was clear, unwavering. "I've brought evidence and testimonies from witnesses at the scene. I want this case to stop being called a misunderstanding." With that, she gave a slight nod toward the attorney. He immediately opened the briefcase, pulled out a hard drive containing the original FOO and printed witness statements from students who had seen everything, laying them neatly on the table. The soft thump of papers hid in wood sounded like a judge's gavel starting a trial. The prosecutor reached out, eyes shifting from suspicion to focus. He turned on the small screen in the room, playing the full video from the student's phone. The shout, "Stay down," echoed through the space, followed by the image of Kane striking with the baton, Maya collapsing. The room felt silent. Only the quickened breathing of a few assistants could be heard. The prosecutor leaned back, rubbing his forehead, then straightened up and tapped his pen on the table. "This is no longer speculation. This is the truth." His words dropped slowly but firmly like a bolt locking the door to retreat. Evelyn proceeded to hand over the stack of testimonies, each one clearly typed, describing in detail every moment that had taken place. The attorney presented calmly, his voice steady and measured, emphasizing that these were direct witnesses, undeniable. Every statement, every image, every second of footage was like an arrow pinning down the wall of silence the system had built for so long. Evelyn sat still, fingers intertwined, eyes locked on the prosecutor. She knew today's move was only the beginning of a long battle, and her resolve would be the foundation on which the whole truth would be built. When the meeting ended, the prosecutor stood holding the stack of documents in his hand and nodded to Evelyn. "We'll initiate the investigation immediately." That confirmation filled the heavy room with new energy. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, letting out a deep breath, not to release the burden, but to mark that from this moment on every step had to be steady. The lawyer beside her gave a light squeeze to her shoulder, and the look they exchanged needed no words. It was enough to affirm that they now stood on the same path, a path with only one destination: justice. Out in the hallway, reporters were still waiting, and when the door opened, the image of Evelyn stepping out with her lawyer, her face calm yet resolute, was quickly captured and broadcast across all media channels. What people saw was not just a mother seeking justice for her daughter, but a citizen daring daring to challenge power, bringing truth to confront lie. And so the official investigation began, opening a new chapter in the storm the entire country was following breath by breath. As the evidence was laid on the table, the interrogation room door opened and Officer Kane entered, his demeanor unchanged. He sat down with arms crossed, his eyes defiant, as he stared straight at the prosecutor. Faced with clear footage and mounting witness statements, Kane maintained a cold, dismissive tone as if it were all a joke. She resisted. "I was just doing my job," he said, spitting each word with defiance. The air in the room froze. That arrogance landed like a slap to everyone working to bring justice to light. People exchanged glances, outrage written across their faces, because instead of remorse, he wore his cruelty like a badge shielded by power. The lead prosecutor remained composed, but a flash of anger crossed his eyes. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he set his pen down on the folder and let silence fill the room. The quiet was so thick that even the sound of breathing rang loud, as if everyone were waiting to see whether Kane would recognize any part of his guilt. But he sat tall, chin raised, that crooked smirk stirring the room into silent fury. In that instant, a young prosecutor stood abruptly, eyes blazing, his voice breaking the weight in the air. "I will bring the truth to light." That vow wasn't a spontaneous outburst, it was a roar from deep inside someone who had seen too much injustice. The room froze, then all eyes turned to him. In the young prosecutor's gaze, there was no hesitation, only unshakable resolve. He stepped forward, laying a hand on the thick case file as if to say that every page, every word inside it would be the hammer to crush Kane's arrogance. Kane looked at him, a flicker of mockery in his eyes, but for the first time the corners of his mouth faltered, his smirk no longer whole. The air was tight as a stretched wire, but in that moment everyone in the room felt something had shifted. The young prosecutor's vow sparked like a flame, lighting up a room thick with suffocating tension. It wasn't just aimed at Kane, it carried a message to all those hiding behind the shadow of power that justice still had defenders willing to stand their ground. Evelyn sat nearby, her eyes glowing with a renewed sense of faith. For the first time since Maya collapsed, she felt her pain was no longer hers alone. She gave a small nod, her gaze fixed on the young prosecutor, as if passing to him the strength to continue this perilous but necessary journey. In that room, the contrast was sharper than ever. On one side stood a man clinging stubbornly to a badge to justify his violence, and on the other people who had turned their outrage into purpose, their belief into action. And along that fragile divide, the words, "I will bring the truth to light," etched themselves deep like a declaration of war, opening a new chapter in an unforgiving confrontation. Inside the police headquarters, the upstairs meeting room, usually filled with the quiet hum of ceiling fans and the stale smell of cold coffee, felt more suffocating than ever. Stacks of case files sat unopened on the table, and all eyes were locked on one another, tense and untrusting. The air was thick with suspicion and fatigue, and chairs creaked as a few officers shifted uncomfortably, trying to hide their restlessness. From the hallway came the sound of footsteps, but once the door shut, only a heavy silence remained, as if the entire room was waiting for someone to finally speak. A young officer, his face pale after days of reading headlines about the growing protests, slammed his hand on the table, voice trembling but firm. "We can't keep covering this up." His words dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples across the room. A few lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact, but others gave small nods as if someone had finally spoken what they were all thinking. The discontent had been there for a long time, but no one dared to say it until now. His words lit the fuse. Tension escalated when an older lieutenant colonel furrowed his brow and tapped his fingers slowly against the table. speaking in a low-weighted voice. "We made a serious mistake. A child is in the hospital, the entire country is furious, and we're pretending nothing happened." The room froze. Uneasy glances met across the table, and the cracks in the department's unity became unmistakable. Whispers spread, some shook their heads, others sighed, but no one could deny that the fire outside had started to burn through the walls they once thought impenetrable. At the head of the table, the commanding officer slammed his gavel down, voice low and furious. "Villains, anyone who speaks again will face disciplinary action. We need to hold the line." But the command no longer carried the absolute authority it once did. In the eyes of those seated below, fear mixed with defiance. They understood that the longer they stayed silent, the deeper they sank into the same pit. Outside, the chants of justice for Maya continued to roar, and inside the first fractures had begun to show in the wall of power. A few officers near the door exchanged glances, their eyes revealing an internal struggle. They knew that to remain silent was to become complicit, but to speak out would come at a high cost. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't one of obedience, it was filled with unease. The system, once a solid block of stone, had started to crack from within, and no one could say how much longer it would hold. The murmurs hadn't yet settled when, from the head of the table, the chief suddenly shot to his feet, his face flushed red, slamming his hand down so hard the sound echoed through the room. His voice lashed out, each word like a whip cracking against the ears of his subordinates. "Anyone who leaks anything is out." The sharp command rang out, stunning the room into stillness. Eyes that had sparked with resistance immediately dropped, and hands clenched on the table began to tremble. The air was so thick that even breaths seemed loud, and an oppressive silence wrapped around them all. No one dared utter another word, because the shadow of the chief's authority still loomed overhead, ready to crush anyone who dared defy it. But that silence wasn't true obedience. It was more like a frozen lake beneath which water still rushed violently. The officers around the table exchanged glances for a brief moment, their eyes saying more than words ever could. They knew the chief's fury couldn't extinguish their conscience. Outside, the chants of thousands still seemed to seep through the concrete walls, reminding them that silence meant betrayal. Those clinging to power could threaten, but inside many, guilt had already kindled a quiet flame, ready to ignite at any moment. In the corner of the room, a middle-aged officer sat with his head bowed, face tense, eyes filled with turmoil. He had once believed in the force, had thought keeping order meant protecting the community. But after seeing the bloodied image of Maya and hearing Evelyn's declaration to the crowd, that belief had shattered. The chief's outburst only made it harder to breathe. In his mind, a thought flickered, uncertain at first, but soon crystal clear the truth must come out, no matter the cost. The meeting ended in silence, each person leaving without holding eye contact for long, as if even a glance might be used against them. That middle-aged officer walked quietly back to his office, shut the door tight, and sat down with a pounding heart. On his desk sat a stack of classified files, thick folders filled with internal reports, buried evidence, and memos that never reached the public. His hands shook as he turned each page, the scent of old paper and ink hitting him with a strange mix of familiarity and dread. He stopped at a detailed report of the incident, listing timestamps, the names of officers present, and a forced conclusion that read the actions fell within the scope of duty. As he read those words, his fist clenched, fury rising hot in his chest. His eyes drifted toward the window where the glow of streetlights filtered in, and somewhere in the distance the chants of justice for Maya still echoed from the central square. In that moment he understood that silence only deepens the darkness. He pulled open a drawer, retrieved a small hidden USB drive, and carefully began copying all the critical documents onto it. Each keystroke rang through the night like a hammer striking against the wall of silence his superiors had built. When the transfer was complete, he slipped the USB into his coat pocket, his hands still trembling, but his gaze now steady. Late that night, he stepped out of the building, the cold wind slapping against his face, but unable to chase away the rising rising tension inside him. On the quiet street, he stopped at a small cafe, sat in a corner, opened his personal laptop, and activated a secure connection. The email address of a trusted investigative journalist was already on the screen. He didn't write much, just a few direct words. This is what they're hiding. Attaching the file, he took a deep breath, then hit send. The screen flickered and he closed his eyes as if shedding a weight that had pressed on him for far too long. On the other end, the journalist opened the file, eyes widening as they scanned the first lines. The information was too clear, too complete to be denied. In that instant, the wheel of truth began to turn unstoppable. And, in the dark corner of a city in turmoil, one anonymous officer had chosen to betray silence in order to remain loyal to justice. That morning, major news outlets simultaneously released a new video, no longer the blurry, shaky footage captured in haste, but a sharp, unfiltered original. A 4K camera clip, kept by a student all this time, had been sent to the press, and within hours the footage spread like wildfire. The screen showed every detail clearly. Kane's face flushed with rage. His shout of "Stay down" rang out crisply. Then the baton struck Maya's head. Blood splattered and students' terrified screams pierced through the chaos. There was no room left for denial, no space for excuses. The entire truth was laid bare before the public in all its unhideable brutality. As soon as the video aired, public squares, cafes, and markets across the country erupted. People gathered around large screens watching in stunned silence, then suddenly rose together, fists raised, shouting, "No more lies." The chant thundered like a storm, rippling from one crowd to the next, forming an unstoppable wave. Faces, once clouded by doubt, now lit up with a sense of release, with the belief that at last truth had triumphed over cold denial. Print newspapers issued special editions with bold front-page headlines screaming "The Naked Truth in Plain Sight." Television networks cut their programming to broadcast the video on a loop, every anchor speaking with a trembling voice. A seasoned journalist broke down in tears on live air saying, "We cannot turn away from this image. This is a stain on the entire system." Millions watched, rewatched, and shared every frame, transforming Maya into the symbol of a truth once trampled, now rising. Out on the streets, people carried loudspeakers, replaying the video from mobile screens so no passerby could look away. Protests surged with renewed force, no longer driven by abstract calls for justice, but ignited by visual proof that deepened the fury. Students brought the clip to school, played it for classmates, teachers, showed it in classrooms, and young faces froze as they witnessed the raw truth. The cry of "No more lies" echoed from schoolyards into nearby streets, merging into a chorus of thousands. In that moment, the system that had long hidden behind a veil of excuses began to crack. There was no way to refute it, no shield left for those who tried to obscure it. The evidence was too clear, too brutal, making every past lie sound ridiculous. And across the nation, from small homes and roadside diners to towering city buildings, people spoke in unison, declaring one undeniable truth: no more lies. As the high-definition video circulated widely, public scrutiny extended beyond Officer Kane. In every frame, viewers clearly saw Officer Briggs standing just behind him, his eyes avoiding the scene, his arms hanging limp, making no move to intervene, even as his colleague struck down a student. That image became the second piece of evidence, a testament to complicity. News outlets quickly published analyses pointing out that Briggs wasn't just present, but that his silence served as a silent nod to the violence. On social media, waves of outrage exploded. Silence is a crime, too. He chose the side of violence by doing nothing. Once overlooked, Briggs's name now trended his image, spreading alongside thousands of furious comments. Outside the police station, protesters raised new signs demanding not only justice for Maya, but a full investigation into everyone present that day. One student shouted through a megaphone, "Briggs saw it." Briggs stayed stayed silent. Briggs must be held accountable. The chants echoed, merging with the public's rising anger, putting even more pressure on a department already cracking from within. Officials issued a statement claiming Briggs was in a passive state, but such excuses no longer held weight. The public looked at the footage, listened again to the audio, and concluded if Briggs had truly wanted to stop it, he could have. That silence became an invisible sentence, a stain not easily erased. As criticism of Briggs mounted, the news of Kane's official suspension was announced. The police chief's office released the statement in a brief press conference, the spokesperson's voice cold, tight with tension. Officer Kane will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Just one sentence, but it sparked cheers outside the police department. Protesters raised their fists, shouting justice for Maya, seeing it as the first step toward fairness. The image of Kane, arrogantly seated in the interrogation room, now stood in stark contrast to the footage of him walking out of the station, head down like a defeated man. That clip, replayed again and again on television, became a symbol of collapse. In cafes, offices, and schools, the news spread like fire, sparking lively conversations, part relief, part anticipation. To many, this was only the beginning, because a suspension could never make up for the blood and tears already shed. But it proved, at least, that truth, fueled by public pressure, could shake the system. As for Evelyn, when she heard about Kane's suspension, she didn't smile or applaud. Her eyes simply reflected a cold glint. She knew the road ahead was long, but the door to justice had opened, and from this moment on, there was no shutting it again. On the day of the public trial, the city's central courthouse was packed from early morning. Outside, the gate lines of reporters held up cameras, microphones, jostling signs demanding justice, clutched tightly in the hands of citizens, their chants echoing from the streets into the courtroom itself. Inside, white ceiling lights reflected off tense faces. Every seat was taken the press section, completely full lenses, zooming in on every movement of the key figures. Evelyn sat in the front row, her expression calm but her eyes blazing. She didn't bow her head, didn't look away. Just across from her, Kane was escorted in wearing a prison uniform, hands cuffed, but the defiant look on his face remained. When the judge struck the gavel to begin, the room instantly grew heavy. The young prosecutor stood voice firm, laying out the evidence. The 4K clip played on the large screen and the courtroom fell silent. The shout, "Stay down," rang out, followed by the image of Maya collapsing, captured in brutal clarity. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some swallowed their tears. Others covered their faces. Kane looked up at the screen, his face twitching slightly. Then, suddenly, he sprang up and shouted, voice hoarse with rage, "That girl resisted! I'm innocent!" His harsh cry jolted the room. Several people stood in protest, and boos rang out from all directions. The judge banged the gavel repeatedly to restore order, but the public's fury lingered in the air. Evelyn never looked away from Kane. Her gaze held no blind hatred, only the unshakable strength of someone holding the truth. Amid the chaos, she slowly stood. Without a microphone, her voice still carried. "If you say my daughter resisted, then tell me, how does a 17-year-old carrying school books resist? If you claim innocence, then look into my eyes and tell me where the blood on my daughter's forehead came from." The courtroom went silent for a brief moment. Then the clapping, the chant of justice for Maya erupted like thunder. Kane's face turned pale, his eyes wavering. He tried to shout again, but the crowd's roar drowned him out, reducing his words to noise. Reporters captured every second the image of a mother standing tall in court, facing the man who had once dismissed her child's lie, spread everywhere. The young prosecutor gripped the file in his hands tighter, his eyes glowing his oath from days before now strengthened by Evelyn's resolve. The judge signaled for calm, but in the hearts of everyone present, the truth was already undeniable, and this courtroom confrontation had become more than a legal battle. It was proof of justice rising against arrogance and lies. The courtroom was in chaos from Kane's shouting when Evelyn suddenly stood up. She didn't need a microphone, didn't wait for her turn. Her voice rang out clear and strong like a blade slicing through the noise. "My daughter's in a coma," and he laughs. "Is that your idea of justice?" The question struck like a hammer, firm and sharp, and the entire room instantly fell silent. The only remaining sound was the clerk's pen tapping, until even that stopped, giving way to a heavy silence as if the air itself was about to explode. Every eye turned to Evelyn. Her face was gaunt, her eyes bloodshot from countless sleepless nights, but her gaze was fierce and steady without fear. Standing before hundreds of people in front of cameras, broadcasting live across the nation, she was no longer just a grieving mother, she had become the embodiment of resilience. The courtroom held its breath. No one dared speak, not even the sound of flipping paper remained. Cameras zoomed in rapidly, capturing every expression, every crease on her face, as if afraid to miss a single frame of history. The judge frowned, raising a hand to call for order, but even he couldn't hide his astonishment. Lawyers on both sides leaned toward one another as if they had just witnessed an arrow piercing straight through the heart of deception. Photographers clicked at nonstop flashes sparking across the room, yet Evelyn stood firm, her small shoulders bearing the weight of a nation's fury. No one in that room could deny that her question had struck something deep inside them. Kane, once smug and mocking, had gone pale, lips pressed, tight hands gripping the rail of his seat. He wanted to lash out, to scream, but Evelyn's words had caught in his throat. The crowd remained silent, but not from fear. It was the kind of silence charged with focus, the kind that forms when every eye and ear lock onto one voice. That silence was louder than any chant because it meant every heart there had aligned with hers, that her question had spoken for them all. The cameras kept rolling, broadcasting live to the thousands gathered outside, all watching the giant screens. As Evelyn's words echoed, the crowd outside fell silent, then erupted in a thunderous roar. Inside the courtroom, Evelyn held her head high, her eyes glowing with the fire of someone who had chosen to turn pain into power. And in that silence, everyone understood this trial wasn't just about judging one man. It had become a reckoning for an entire system now forced to confront the most brutal question of all: does justice still exist? After days of intense litigation and a series of submitted evidence, the court moved into closed deliberation. The courtroom was devoid of the usual noise, the lighting softer, the doors firmly shut, no longer crowded with reporters. Only the judge, prosecutors, attorneys, and those directly involved in the case remained. The atmosphere wathic. Every tap of a pen or rustle of paper sounded loud, stretching the tension that had already reached its peak. Evelyn sat quietly in the corner, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the bench. She didn't close her eyes to pray, nor did she shed a tear. She simply held herself in a strange calm, as prepared for any outcome. Kane was brought in wearing a gray prison uniform, hands locked in front of him. Though he looked less aggressive than in previous days, his eyes still flickered with defiance. He sat down, lips pressed tight, face cold, like someone who had never known fear. The young prosecutor placed the file down, took a deep breath, and then lifted his head without saying a word. All eyes turned toward the judge, who had remained silent, hands resting neatly on the desk. When the gavel slammed down, the sound "Ohan" echoed through the room, and everyone stood. The judge's voice rang out low, clear, each word etched into the walls. 20 years in prison for Officer Kane. The verdict landed like a bell toll, cold and final. Evelyn tightened her hands, her vision blurred, but the corners of her mouth lifted slightly, not in triumph, but in release. She didn't look at Kane, only bowed her head gently and whispered something no one could hear, as if speaking to where her daughter still lay motionless. Meanwhile, Kane snapped out of his daze. He glared, tried to shout, but his voice caught his protest, falling flat in the courtroom that had just sealed his fate. 2 officers moved swiftly to escort him out, the clinking of chains loud and clear each step, a punctuation mark ending the arrogance that had long gone unchecked. The young prosecutor stood still quiet, but his eyes gleamed with conviction. The vow to bring the truth to light had been fulfilled. The courtroom returned to silence after everyone left. Evelyn stayed a moment longer, drew a deep breath, then stood her slender frame steady, her gaze unwavering. 20 years couldn't erase the pain, couldn't heal Maya's wounds overnight, but it was proof that justice could still exist, could still speak, even if it had to walk through blood, tears, and relentless persistence. For Evelyn, the sentence wasn't the end, but a milestone in the journey she had begun, a journey the entire community was now walking beside her. The moment the judge closed the session, the room sank into heavy silence. Evelyn sat still, her shoulders trembling as relief and pain surged at once. She opened her bag and pulled out a photo of Maya, the same one that once sat neatly on a school desk, now carried like a treasured keepsake. Her eyes blurred with tears, her trembling hands clutching the frame to her chest. The tears no longer came as gut-wrenching sobs like in the early days, but as a quiet stream, as if to wash away the bitterness long held inside. She whispered, her voice breaking between gasps, "Maya, justice spoke your name. I kept my promise." That little photo became her only anchor in a moment where the world seemed to collapse and begin again all at once. The reporters witnessing it didn't dare push forward with their microphones. They simply raised their cameras silently, capturing the image of a mother holding her daughter's photo, eyes gently closed as if trying to pass warmth through the cold glass. That image spread almost instantly, becoming a symbol of truth and resilience. She didn't need to say more. The photo in her hands spoke for her, showing that behind the verdict stood a broken family, and from its ashes, a new strength had emerged. In Evelyn's tear-filled eyes there was no sense of triumph, only the understanding that the journey was far from over. Justice for Maya was just the beginning. The system still hid many shadows, waiting to be brought into the light. Meanwhile, in the front row, the police chief sat frozen like a statue. From the moment the sentence was read, he'd kept his head bowed, hands clasped tightly on his knees, sweat glistening on his temple. Throughout the trial, he had remained silent, but when Kane was convicted, the power he had long clung to began to crumble. Now, public outrage is no longer focused on one man, but has turned toward those who enabled, concealed, and allowed it all to happen. The camera lights panned across the room, catching the exact moment the chief lowered his head, his eyes evasive, his face stunned. Immediately after the hearing, prosecutors announced an expanded investigation. The chief's name was stated outright. He would face questions about suppressed internal reports and vague directives that had buried the truth. Outside the courthouse, the news spread fast, a wave of voices rising with it. People shouted, "Investigate them all. No one is above justice." New signs were raised aimed directly at the man who once led the system. And in that moment, the image of the police chief bowing his head became a symbol of collapse, revealing that the wall shield in injustice had begun to crack at its foundation. In the thick air, Evelyn clutched Maya's photo tightly and stepped out of the courtroom surrounded by admiring eyes. She knew justice had finally spoken for her daughter, but the road ahead remained rough. The chief and the system behind him would now have to face the truth, and that frail mother had become the flame that would not let the darkness return. The date of the national press conference was set, and television cameras from across the country turned toward the government headquarters where the large doors to the briefing room opened, and a flood of reporters rushed in, filling every seat. The air was thick, and everyone was waiting for the official statement after an unprecedented wave of upheaval. On the podium, the national flag hung neatly below it, sat a row of senior officials and representatives of the judicial system. Beside them was an empty row reserved for those who once led the police department. But as the announcement began, that row remained eerily vacant, its silence serving as a silent confession of a collapse too massive to deny. The spokesperson stood, voice calm, but every word dropping like a hammer. He announced that a series of senior officers had submitted their resignations, including those once considered the right hand of the police chief. The list was long filled with familiar names, one once praised at award ceremonies now read out in an atmosphere heavy with finality. Reporters scrambled to take notes, and the constant clicking of cameras echoed through the room. The silence was broken only by hushed murmurs as everyone realized this was the sign that a once rock-solid institution was crumbling at its core. The spokesperson continued confirming that public trust had been lost. Surveys showed the police department's approval rating had plummeted to record lows, and multiple communities had declared a refusal to cooperate until full reform was enacted. On the screen behind him, footage of marches from across cities played on loop the chant, "Justice for Maya," blending with the anger of the people. The truth, now exposed, didn't just condemn an individual, but dragged into the light an entire rotten system. Inside the chamber, a few young officers, never involved in scandal, sat quietly, eyes lowered, caught between shame and bitterness. They knew they hadn't committed the crimes, but they also knew the uniform they wore had lost its meaning. Outside, headlines ran bold across news sites. Police department loses public trust. Unprecedented wave of resignations. Citizens shared the news as proof that their voices had power, that finally the wall of power once thought untouchable had been brought down. Evelyn watched the press conference from the hospital, her gaze no longer blazing as it once was, but steady with resolve. She clutched Maya's photo tightly in her hands, let out a long breath, and understood that her daughter's spilled blood had shaken an institution that once believed it stood above all judgment. For other mothers, watching her image became a beacon, a reminder that justice, though delayed, can still bring darkness to its knees. And on that day, as the list of resignations was read aloud, one truth became undeniable. The police department was no longer an untouchable wall. It was rubble beneath the weight of justice. As the press conference entered its final moments, the entire room fell silent, waiting for a decisive voice. The spotlight swept across the guest seats and stopped where Evelyn sat. The host gave a signal. A microphone was passed to her, and she slowly stood up. On the large screen, the image of a mother who had fought with unwavering resolve came into focus. Her face thin, but her eyes burning bright. Evelyn clutched the photo of Maya in her hand, and her voice rose warm and steady, not trembling but firm like an oath. "We don't need violence to protect. We need justice to live." Her words carried no anger, only the weight of truth. They held the room breathless, every eye turned toward her, every heart tightened by the simplicity and certainty in each word. Applause erupted, at first sparse, then growing, and finally thunderous like a wave. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment Evelyn's face illuminated under the glaring lights, her voice rapidly shared across media channels. On social media, the quote, "We don't need violence to protect. We need justice to live," became a new banner paired with images of Maya transformed into the symbol of a movement far larger than the original incident. Out on the street, citizens watching from public screens raised hastily written signs bearing those very words, shouting them in unison as a collective declaration. Immediately following her speech, a government official stepped onto the stage, his voice calm but resolute. He declared before the cameras, "Given what has occurred and the deep loss of public trust, the police department will be officially disbanded." The words struck like lightning. The hall exploded with applause and cheers. Reporters shouted updates into their microphones. TV channels ran headlines across the screen, "Police department disbanded." Outside, the crowd watching the live feed broke into emotional celebration. People embraced and tears flowed, not from pain, but from the belief that justice had truly emerged from the shadow. In that moment, Evelyn stood still. She clutched the photo of Maya tightly, her eyes brimming as she looked up at the ceiling, glowing with light as if whispering to her daughter lying motionless. This wasn't revenge. It was release. A system that once shielded violence had collapsed, and the truth had finally spoken. Other mothers in the room wiped their tears, nodding toward Evelyn, feeling the power radiating from one ordinary person who dared to rise. The decision to disband the police department entered entered history as proof that the will of the people can bring down even the most impenetrable walls. And in that moment, Evelyn, standing tall, raising the photo of Maya, became an unforgettable image affirming that justice never arrives through violence but through the resolve of hearts that refuse to stop fighting. The memorial day at the school where Maya once studied took place in an atmosphere both solemn and deeply emotional. The schoolyard, once filled with laughter, had fallen silent as hundreds of students and teachers gathered beneath a flag lowered to half-staff, honoring the girl who had become the symbol of a generation. Stone benches, hallways, and classrooms were adorned with white ribbons, and in every hand was a small bouquet, some hastily placed in plastic cups. Others neatly prepared, all carrying the same message, admiration and sorrow. The silence hung like a slow musical note, leaving room for every footstep to echo. Inside the main auditorium, a giant board had been set up, stretching across the front wall. It started as a blank white canvas, but soon, one by one, students stepped forward with black markers writing messages from the heart. In the center, the bold words, "Justice for all," stood out. Around them, more messages appeared, small promises like "I won't stay silent," and bigger hopes such as "One day justice will always be on the right side." Each shaky stroke, each messy line carried weight. In its rawness lay its power. Every word was a statement, a mark showing that this generation had understood and was ready to change. Teachers stood quietly at the back, many in tears, as they watched their students' once innocent faces now bearing more serious eyes. They remembered the cowardly silence on the day Maya collapsed, and now remorse made them bow their heads while awakening compelled them to rise. One elderly teacher hand, trembling, wrote, "Silence is complicity," a simple sentence that stilled the entire hall. The sound of the pen scratching the board echoed like a warning bell, more powerful than any speech. Out in the schoolyard, student desks were arranged in circles. Kids sat hand in hand, reading aloud stories about Maya, not just about the pain she endured, but also the simple dreams she held going to college, becoming a doctor to help poor children. Every story lit a candle of memory, keeping Maya's flame alive. Real candles were also lit, their soft golden light reflected in the shining eyes of the children, forming a small but steady sea of light, a silent vow that justice must be built from compassion. By the end of the ceremony, the massive board was covered in signatures, transformed into a wall of hope. Young students hugged one another, eyes bright with the belief that silence would no longer be repeated, that their voices could help preserve justice for all. And the school, once the backdrop of pain, had now awakened, becoming the starting point of a new journey, where the greatest lesson was not found in any textbook, but written into the hearts of those who lived it. As the memorial ceremony reached its most solemn moment, the teachers stood in a line at the front of the hall. Their eyes scanned the students' young faces full of resilience before settling on the board covered in the words, "Justice for all." In that moment, an undeniable truth surfaced. Their silence on the day Maya collapsed had become a shared wound, one that the entire school now carried with deep regret. A middle-aged teacher stepped forward, his voice trembling, hands clenched tightly together, eyes red with emotion. "We failed to protect a student. We chose silence when we should have stepped in. Today, on behalf of the faculty, I bow my head in apology." He bowed deeply, and the entire auditorium fell silent, the only sound being the quiet sobs of students who could no longer hold back their tears. That gesture of bowing wasn't an excuse, but a direct admission, a necessary act of repentance to lift the shadow that had long loomed over the school. The other teachers followed suit, each one bowing their head, each tear falling onto the tiled floor, each sigh a confession. They understood that their silence that day wasn't just cowardice. It had allowed violence to continue. On the faces of the students there was no triumph, only a hopeful gaze that the adults would no longer longer turn away from the truth. Amid the heavy atmosphere, a student suddenly stood up from the back row. He wasn't tall, and his voice wasn't loud, but every word he spoke cut like a blade. Silence is a crime, too. The entire hall felt shaken, and every eye turned toward him. The simplicity of his words carried more weight than any long speech. It wasn't just a reminder for the teachers, but a message to the entire community that indifference to evil is the same as enabling it. Those words echoed, carving themselves into the minds of everyone present. Some students buried their faces in their hands. Others nodded through tears while the teachers sat in silence, their shoulders trembling with shame. But soon that silence transformed into resolve, because everyone understood that today's lesson wasn't just about remembering Maya. It was about making sure that mistake was never repeated. As the ceremony came to a close, the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the whiteboard, now filled with writing, and at its center, the student's quote stood out boldly. It became the school's new declaration that from now on, silence would have no place, and the responsibility to protect justice belongs to everyone. The university hall that day was radiant with lights packed with rows of students, professors, and guests from various places who had arrived early. The atmosphere was solemn, yet filled with anticipation as everyone waited to meet the woman who had compelled an entire nation to reconsider the meaning of justice. On the large screen behind the podium, an image of Maya smiling brightly was projected, a reminder of why they had all gathered here. When Evelyn appeared, the entire auditorium rose to their feet, the applause stretching on endlessly, not just as a greeting, but as an act of honor. She stepped out in simple attire, her small frame, steady eyes, bright, walking calmly as if she had long been prepared for this moment. When Evelyn placed her hand on the microphone, the room fell completely silent. She didn't look at any notes, nor did she need an introduction, because everything she brought came directly from the heart. Her voice rang out warm and steady. "I'm just a mother, but when justice is trampled, anyone can rise." The words echoed like a bell, sending a ripple through the hall. Students seated below many with tearful eyes, others nodding firmly as if they had just found clarity for their long-held anger. Hands shot up into the air, applause thundered, and a unified chant rose toward the high ceiling. Evelyn paused briefly, letting the weight of her words settle over the room, then continued. She spoke about the journey of turning loss into strength, recounting the long days beside Maya's hospital bed, where she realized that silence only deepens the darkness, and speaking out is the only way to spark light. She emphasized that she was not extraordinary, held no special power, only love and an unyielding will. That, she said, is something everyone in this room could possess. Her words were plain, unembellished, but that made them even more powerful because they were built on a truth that had shaken an entire system. The audience listened in complete silence, the only sounds being scribbled notes and camera shutters capturing each moment. Evelyn said that justice should not be treated as a luxury, but as essential as air and water. She declared that if a child walks into a classroom in fear, then that society has failed to protect its own future. Students in the front row nodded repeatedly, some squeezing the hand of the person next to them, others quietly wiping their tears, all of them realizing they were no longer just spectators but part of the story. When Evelyn ended her speech, she didn't promise anything grand. She simply smiled and said, "Real power lies in what we choose to do when faced with injustice." The hall erupted in applause and chants of her name. The image of Evelyn, small and steady before a sea of people, a spotlight shining directly down on her, lit her up as if glowing, captured on camera, and spread instantly. Without a title, without an official role, only through courage and love, she had become a living symbol for an entire generation. And from that moment on, it was clear her story no longer ended with a single case. It had become a legacy of spirit-inspiring hearts far beyond the walls of that auditorium. As the speech concluded, the hall exploded in cheers. Thousands of students rose in unison, arms, raised voices calling Evelyn thundering from the front rows to the very back. That rolling sound echoed off the high walls, bounced back, and became wave after wave, turning the air into a celebration of courage. Evelyn stood still, her hand placed on her chest, eyes filled with tears. She had never imagined that her name, once tied only to hard days, and a mother's sacrifice, would now be shouted with reverence by an entire generation. She bowed her head slowly, answering their call with a quiet smile, and in that moment a mother became a flame, passed from her heart into the thousands beating before her. Journalists crammed into the back of the auditorium, cameras sweeping to capture the exact moment when thousands of students shouted the name of a woman. Within minutes, the scene was live on television and across social media, turning the university hall into a national focal point. Online headlines followed swiftly, bold text flashing across screens like a declaration, the mother who brought down a police department. From then on, the name Evelyn was no longer tied only to grief and resistance, but redefined as the embodiment of maternal strength and resilience in the face of injustice. Opinion pieces were published that very night, emphasizing that the title was not empty praise, but a reflection of undeniable truth. A woman without an army, without political power, armed only with love for her daughter and a belief in justice, had brought a corrupted system to its knees. Commentators on television admitted that no movement had ever been sparked with such force by a single individual, and that Evelyn had proven a truth: when love and truth stand together, they can overcome any oppressive force. Students continued to share her image and words across social media, turning the story into an academic movement. In lecture halls, many professors incorporated her speech into class discussions as a living example of the power of courage. Posters bearing the phrase, "the mother who brought down a police department," appeared on dorm walls and student cafes, even on graffiti murals along city streets. It was no longer just a headline, it had become the slogan of a new generation, one that believed a mother's voice could shake an entire society. Evelyn received it all with quiet composure. She knew the recognition wasn't meant to elevate her, but to remind everyone that anyone could be a voice for justice. As she was leaving, students gathered around her, holding her hands, calling her name, their eyes shining as if they were receiving a flame passed down from a previous generation. Evelyn smiled, holding Maya's photo close to her chest, whispering to herself, "You made me into someone I never thought I could be." And in that moment, she was no longer a woman carrying grief alone. She had become a shared symbol, one etched into memory by love, by a promise, and by the belief that justice can never be extinguished. In the hospital room, bathed in soft light, the sound of the ventilator echoed like the slow heartbeat of time. On the pristine white bed, Maya lay still, her face thin and pale, but her breathing steadier than in the days before. The heavy air suddenly shifted when her eyelashes fluttered and her eyes slowly opened after the long, unbroken coma. A faint spark flickered in her pupils, filling the once cold room with sudden warmth. The nurse rushed to call the doctor, but Evelyn stood frozen, her trembling hands pressed tightly around her daughter's. She couldn't believe the moment she had waited for day after day, night after night, had finally come. Evelyn leaned down, holding her daughter close, tears pouring uncontrollably. Pain, long held and dissolved into relief, making her voice hoarse as she whispered, "You gave me the strength to never back down." Maya turned slowly. Her lips moved, but no words yet formed, only her tearful eyes fixed on her mother, eyes filled with gratitude and deep love. Evelyn gripped the fragile hand tightly, her heart overwhelmed with the feeling of life being returned to her. The room seemed brighter, the beeping machines no longer cold, but a melody marking a new beginning. The doctor entered quickly, checked the monitors, then gave a soft, relieved smile and nodded to confirm Maya was out of danger. The medical staff in the room were visibly moved, many unable to hold back tears as they witnessed the reunion of mother and daughter after such a long stretch of despair. Evelyn wiped away her tears, though a radiant smile now shone on her face, a rare one since the tragedy began. Maya gently closed her eyes, her breath steady, her hand clasping her mother's without letting go, as if afraid this might all vanish like a dream. News of Maya waking spread quickly, first through the hospital corridors where people had kept vigil, then to the media outlets. Outside, those gathered in the courtyard looked up when they heard cheering from the upper floor windows, and the crowd erupted. They held hands, shouting Maya's name, celebrating the moment as a shared victory. On social media, the good news traveled fast. Thousands of joyful posts appeared. Maya opened her eyes. Justice wasn't in vain. A miracle has arrived. In the hospital room, Evelyn remained at her daughter's side, eyes never leaving her every small movement. She knew the journey ahead would still be long, but as long as Maya was awake, every sacrifice had been worth it. She kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered again, not as comfort, but as a declaration of truth. "You made me stronger than anything. Because of you, the whole world has changed." Maya gave a slight nod, her eyes bright, and in that moment they both understood the storm had passed and a new dawn had arrived, bringing hope not just for one family, but for a community rising again from the shadows. The news that Maya had opened her eyes sparked a wave of emotion across the city. Within hours, the once somber hospital turned into a gathering place of hope. People from all neighborhoods arrived with vibrant bouquets lining the walkway to the main entrance. Red roses, white carnations, and bright yellow sunflowers blended into a sea of color never seen in a place usually filled with white lab coats and the scent of antiseptic. Each flower came with a small note, simple yet heartfelt messages. "Maya, stay strong. We believe in you. You are our hope." The hospital wall quickly transformed into a giant canvas of color, no longer a cold barrier between life and death, but a wall lit by faith. Parents brought their children, pointing at the radiant pile of flowers, explaining that these weren't just gifts for one girl, but a promise that justice would never be forgotten. Many students in school uniforms leaned on each other to write new signs beside the wreaths, their handwriting clumsy but full of resolve. Strangers embraced outside the hospital gates as if they'd known each other for years, their tears no longer born of despair, but of shared compassion and hope. The hospital, once a witness to pain, had become a symbol. Each flower laid was like a brick rebuilding lost trust. Inside the hospital room, Maya was allowed to sit up briefly. Light from the window spilled onto her pale face, but her eyes shimmered with life. Evelyn sat close, one arm supporting her back, the other gripping her small hand, her gaze full of tenderness. Maya looked out the window at the hundreds of flowers, her lips trembling before forming a faint smile. Fragile as it was, that smile outshone any bouquet. It was her first since the long coma. Evelyn's eyes welled up as she pressed her forehead to her daughter's hair and whispered, "You've opened a new chapter for yourself and for all of us." The doctors and nurses in the room fell silent, smiling with eyes that sparkled with indescribable joy. One of them quietly said, "This isn't just a patient recovering, it's a miracle the whole community made possible." The words only deepened Evelyn's belief that her daughter had been saved not just by medicine, but by the strength of thousands of compassionate hearts outside. Maya leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, her smile still present like a promise that she would continue the journey that so many had placed their hope in. And in that moment, the hospital no longer felt heavy. It became a lighthouse illuminating the path for a generation moving forward with a hunger for justice and humanity. The city night sank into silence, streetlights casting pale yellow halos onto the hospital courtyard. A soft wind slipped through the window of the hospital room, carrying the chill of year's end. Evelyn sat alone in a small corner, an old leather notebook open on the table beside a steaming cup of tea. The room was quiet, save for the steady beep of the heart monitor next to Maya's bed and the faint scratch of pen on paper. She took a deep breath, her shoulders still heavy from the long days of struggle. but her eyes no longer showed exhaustion. They held a quiet strength forged in the heart of the storm. She wrote slowly, each word etched with care and weight. Justice is not a privilege. It is the right to survive. She paused, staring at the words on the page, her hand trembling with emotion. Throughout the journey, Evelyn had come to understand that justice was not only about punishing the guilty, but about protecting the vulnerable, allowing them to live, to learn to dream. It wasn't a gift to be handed down, but a basic human right, inseparable from existence itself. Memories returned like a slow-motion reel. Maya, lying motionless in the hospital bed the nights Evelyn held her daughter's hand and whispered promises not to give up. She recalled the crowd in the square chanting, "Justice for Maya," the tense courtroom, and the moment the judge delivered a verdict that would shake the system. Each memory carried pain but also pride, proof that an ordinary mother could turn grief into power and force change into being. The pen moved again. Evelyn wrote that the greatest lesson wasn't found in the courtroom or in the headlines, but in the human heart. It was the unity of a community, the courage of witnesses, and the voices of students and teachers that made the miracle real. Without them, she would have remained a mother alone in private sorrow, and Maya just another forgotten name. Justice, she wrote, is the product of solidarity, a power that cannot be bought and once ignited cannot be extinguished by any force. Evelyn closed the notebook and looked over at Maya sleeping peacefully, a faint smile touching her lips in sleep. She reached out and gently stroked her daughter's hair, feeling warmth return after so many cold days. Her heart softened, yet it felt stronger than ever. She knew the journey was not over, but the greatest legacy had already been written, not in the sentence of a guilty man, but in the change now spreading through every person, every home, every classroom. Outside, the city still glowed under the late-night lights, but for Evelyn, the real light lay in the words just written. Justice is not a privilege. It is the right to survive. She whispered it again, as if sending it to herself, to Maya, and to everyone who had stood up. And from that moment on, the final lesson no longer belonged to just one family, but became a shared legacy, a door open to all who dared to believe in the power of truth and courage. As Evelyn's journal entries gradually spread through the press, the story of Maya and her mother moved beyond national borders. International news outlets broadcast images of crowds chanting for justice, replayed the moment the trial ended, and the instant Maya opened her eyes after the coma. From major European newsrooms to Asian networks, the event was cited as a symbol against violence, not only police violence, but all forms of injustice that suppress human dignity. In distant squares, murals of Maya's face appeared next to Evelyn's words, translated into many languages. The story crossed borders, becoming a source of inspiration for communities that had long remained silent to finally find their voice. On social media, numerous campaigns were launched. Hashtags about Maya appeared in various languages, tied to calls for the protection of human rights. International organizations released statements using the case as evidence of the urgent need to reform law enforcement across multiple regions. Students in different countries organized forums, replayed video clips, read aloud Evelyn's journal entries, and then discussed ways to turn the story into concrete action. Many parents retold the events to their children as a moral lesson that one brave mother could spark a change once believed impossible by the system itself. The image of Maya smiling faintly in her hospital bed became a vivid testament to resilience. Photos capturing that moment made front pages of international newspapers, accompanied by headlines reading "Hope returns from the darkness." No one saw it as an isolated case anymore, but as a wake-up call to the world. Human rights groups adopted the story as teaching material, emphasizing that justice exists only when someone dares to stand up for it. And wherever Evelyn's name was mentioned, people remembered the image of an ordinary woman who turned grief into strength, powerful enough to stir the world. From packed public squares to articles and international forums, people agree that the legacy left behind mind does not lie in dry statistics, but in a deeply etched symbol. A single blow, seemingly just an act of brutality in a school hallway, became the spark that ignited a movement powerful enough to shake an entire system. A single vow, whispered in a cold hospital room as a mother held her comatose daughter's hand, became the driving force behind millions of voices rising in unison. And from that moment on, a system once thought untouchable was forced to change. Today, when people speak of Maya and Evelyn, they do so not with pity, but with admiration. They are proof that even the smallest acts lit by courage and conviction can become a guiding flame for all humanity. The legacy left behind is not just justice for one girl, but a renewed understanding in society anyone can become an agent of change. One blow, one vow became a turning point that forced a system to bow before the truth and opened a new chapter in the world where justice is no longer a distant ideal, but the right to survive. The story of Maya and Evelyn does not end as a private family tragedy, but echoes like a bell throughout society. From a school hallway where violence turned a young girl into a victim, to the courtroom where justice was named, every step marked a journey of blood, tears, and finally light. Evelyn, with a mother's heart, turned pain into a weapon against a system built on fear and concealment. That journey not only saved her daughter, but also awakened a community which then grew into a global roar against injustice. What makes this story extraordinary is its transformation from fragility into strength. Evelyn was not born to be a symbol. She only wanted to protect her child, but it was her refusal to bow that made her a landmark. When faced with threats, she did not tremble but responded with a vow of steel. When met with others' silence, she turned it into a resounding voice. In that, an individual who seemed alone became the center of a rising wave, proving that truth always finds a way to rise even when buried beneath layers of power. Maya, though unconscious for many days, remained the flame that lit the way. Her fragile presence forced society to confront a painful question. A student beaten unconscious in school, is that the justice system we want? The answer, clear and urgent, sent thousands to the streets, stripped masks off those who had concealed the truth, and brought a system crashing down under the weight of unity. When Maya opened her eyes, her faint smile was not only a body's triumph over Coma, but a victory of belief that justice can indeed create miracles. The community, once silent out of fear, had learned to speak up. Every student, every parent, every teacher turned their guilt into action, their anger into the chant, "Justice for Maya." The flowers covering the hospital, the boards in the schoolyard reading "Justice for all became proof that truth can light up the human heart. And when millions of hearts beat as one, no system can remain standing. What was once called the power of a badge became small next to the strength of the collective. The 20-year sentence given to Kane was not just punishment for an individual, but a declaration that justice never sleeps. The dissolution of the entire police department was the final result of a chain of resistance, proving that a single blow can usher in an era of change. Evelyn didn't stop at seeking justice for her daughter. She turned it into a shared legacy with a simple yet piercing statement: we don't need violence to protect, we need justice to live. The lesson of this story doesn't lie in the painful footage, but in the choices of each person. It reminds us that staying silent in the face of evil is also a form of wrongdoing, that a mother's promise can shake an entire society, and that the greatest power is not political force or violence, but belief and determination. Evelyn was not a superhero, she was just a mother, but it is that very ordinariness that made her victory the most powerful symbol of all. When the world looks back on this story, what remains is not just the pain left behind, but an indelible legacy. One blow ignited a movement, one vow gave strength to millions, and one faint smile from Maya opened a new chapter for justice. It is a reminder that anywhere, anyone, when justice is trampled, can rise. And it is that rising that changes entire systems.